Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through time. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from tonight. Perhaps you're settling in after a long day. Perhaps the world outside has finally grown quiet. Wherever you are, whatever brought you here, you're welcome. Get comfortable. Adjust your pillows. Let your shoulders drop. Allow your breathing to slow. Tonight, we're traveling to a place that exists now only in fragments, whispers, in ancient texts, traces beneath Spanish soil, echoes of a kingdom that glittered and vanished. The story of Tartessos, a civilization lost to time, waiting to be remembered as you drift toward sleep. Close your eyes, if you haven't already, and imagine the southwestern coast of what we now call Spain. The sun is setting over the Atlantic, casting long golden light across a wide river delta. The air smells of salt and wild herbs. This is the world of ancient civilizations, a Seminot, the grand marble columns of Rome. Not yet, but something older, something that came before. This is bedtime history at its most mysterious, a relaxing history of shadows and suggestions, of wealth beyond measure and questions without answers. Let us begin at the edge of the known world, 3,000 years ago. The land remembers, even when we forget. The land remembers the great river that the Greeks would call the Tartessos, winding through green valleys toward the sea. Today we know it as the Guadalquivir, flowing through Andalusia. But in the Bronze Age, in those distant centuries, it was the lifeblood of a kingdom whose name has become synonymous with mystery itself. Tartessos. Even the word sounds like a whisper, like something half-remembered from a dream. The kingdom, if we can call it that, for we're not entirely certain of its political structure, merged sometime around 1200 BC, as the Bronze Age was reaching its height in the Mediterranean world. This was a time of great movements, of peoples and ideas flowing like water across the ancient world. The Mycenaean palaces were falling. The sea peoples were roaming the eastern Mediterranean. Egypt was entering its long, slow decline into the Third Intermediate Period. And in the far west, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the edge of what most Greeks considered the civilized world, something was taking shape in Iberia. The Tartessians, and we must use this name carefully, for they may not have called themselves this, lived in a land of extraordinary natural wealth. The region was rich in metals, copper and tin, the essential ingredients of bronze, and most precious of all, silver. Silver in quantities that would make them legendary throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Silver that would draw merchants from distant shores, that would fund kingdoms and temples, that would make Tartessos a name whispered in marketplaces from Tyre to Athens. But let us not rush ahead. Let us instead imagine the landscape itself, for this is a sleep meditation history, and the landscape is where we find our peace tonight. Picture the river delta in the early morning, mist rising from the water, herons standing motionless in the shallows. The river fans out into multiple channels here, creating islands and wetlands, reed beds and mudflats that shift with the tides. It's a liminal space, neither fully land nor fully sea, a threshold between worlds. The Greeks, when they came later, would say that the great river had 3 mouths, though the geography has changed much since those days. Earthquakes and silting have altered the coastline. The ancient ports are buried now beneath farmland and marsh. Inland, from the delta, the landscape rises gently into rolling hills covered with cork oak and wild olive. There are valleys where wheat grows in the rich alluvial soil. There are uplands where goats graze on aromatic scrub. And in the mountains, the Sierra Morena to the north. The Sierra Nevada to the east. There are veins of metal, seams of copper and silver and tin, waiting to be discovered, to be extracted, to be transformed. This was the world the Tartessians inherited, shaped, and made their own. A world that provided everything a Bronze Age civilization could want. Fertile land for farming, rivers for transport, forests for timber and fuel, and beneath it all, that extraordinary mineral wealth that would define them in the eyes of their contemporaries and in the fragments of memory that survived their disappearance. Now, you might wonder, and this is natural, lying here in the darkness, your mind beginning to wander, how do we know about Tartessos at all? If it vanished so completely, if it left so few traces, why do we speak of it tonight? Why does it linger in our bedtime history, in our relaxing history of the ancient world? The answer lies in those fragments I mentioned, pieces of a puzzle scattered across time and space. Let us gather them slowly, carefully, the way an archaeologist might brush away soil from a broken pot, revealing it bit by bit. First, there are the ancient texts. Writers from Greece and Rome mention Tartessos, though always with a sense of distance, of hearsay, of legend blurring into fact. The earliest reference may be in the Book of Kings in the Hebrew Bible, though this is debated. The ships of Tarshish mentioned there, some scholars believe this is Tartessos, a place so far away, so fabulously wealthy, that it became proverbial. Ships of Tarshish meant vessels that traveled to the ends of the earth and returned laden with treasure. The Greek poet Stesichorus, writing around 600 BCE, mentioned the kingdom. He called it a place beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar. Later writers elaborated. Herodotus, the father of history, told of a Greek sailor named Calaios, who was blown off course around 638 BCE and stumbled upon Tartessos. The king there, a man named Arganthonios, whose name means silverman, welcomed the Greeks with extraordinary generosity. According to Herodotus, Arganthonios ruled for 80 years and lived to be 120. These are legendary numbers, the kind that accumulate around distant places and distant times. But they tell us something. Tartessos was remembered as a place of longevity, stability, and above all, wealth. The silver, always the silver. Every ancient source that mentions Tartessos mentions the silver. The geographer Strabo, writing in the time of Augustus, said that the Tartessians were so rich in silver that they made their anchors from it. When the first Phoenician merchants arrived, he claimed, they traded simple goods for so much silver that they had to remove the lead from their anchors and replace it with silver just to carry it all home. These stories have the flavor of exaggeration, of travelers' tales told in lamplight, but beneath them lies a truth. The region was genuinely rich in silver, and this wealth genuinely attracted traders from across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians, the great merchant sailors of the ancient world, established a long and profitable relationship with Tartessos. They founded colonies along the southern coast of Iberia, which we know as Cadiz, was the most important trade through these ports. The silver of Tartessos flowed east to Tyre, to Sidon, to every market in the Phoenician trading network. Breathe slowly now. Let these images settle in your mind. Ships with painted sails, their holds heavy with ingots of silver. Merchants bargaining in multiple languages. The glitter of metal in torchlight. This is the stuff of ancient Rome's sleep story and Roman history. For sleep traditions, the great networks of trade that connected the ancient world. The flow of goods and ideas, that made civilization possible. But texts can only tell us so much, especially when they were written by outsiders, by Greeks and Phoenicians, who visited the kingdom or heard of it secondhand. For a more direct connection to the Tartessians themselves, we must turn to archaeology, to the patient work of excavation that has slowly, over the past century, begun to reveal the material culture of this lost people. The most important site is Huelva, near the modern city of the same name, close to where the ancient river mouth would have been. Excavations there have revealed evidence of sustained habitation from the late Bronze Age through the Iron Age. Layers of settlement, one atop another, showing continuity and gradual change. Houses built of mud, brick, and stone. Storage jars for olive oil and grain. Loom weights, suggesting textile production. Slag from metalworking, confirming what the ancient sources told us about the importance of metallurgy. Other sites, the landscape of southwestern Andalusia and Extremadura at Concho Rono. Archaeologists found a remarkable building, possibly a temple or palace, with elaborate architecture, including a courtyard and multiple rooms. It was deliberately destroyed and buried around 400 BCE, for reasons we can only guess at. But before its burial, it was filled with offerings, bronze cauldrons, ivory objects, jewelry, a snapshot of wealth and ritual from the late period of Tartessian culture. At El Carambolo, near Seville, one of the most spectacular finds in Spanish archaeology was uncovered in 1958, a treasure of gold jewelry weighing nearly 3 kilograms. Necklaces, bracelets, and most striking of all, a set of ornamental plaques decorated with intricate patterns, rosettes, geometric designs, granulation so fine it required a magnifying glass to appreciate. The style shows both local tradition and influence from the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly from Phoenician craftsmanship. This is cultural exchange, made tangible, the ancient civilization's assembly of different peoples meeting, trading, learning from one another. And then there are the steely stone markers found throughout the southwest of the Iberian Peninsula, carved with images of warriors bearing distinctive weapons and shields. These date mostly to the late Bronze Age, around 1200 to 800 BCE, and they may represent an earlier phase of the culture that would become Tartessian. The warriors carry vinached shields, longswords, and sometimes chariots. They are static, formal figures, yet they speak of a society that valued martial prowess, that commemorated its warriors in stone, that had the organization and resources to create permanent monuments. Sleep comes easier when we can picture these things: the cool touch of worked gold, the rough surface of carved stone, the weight of a bronze sword. These are the textures of the past, the sensory details that make history something more than abstract dates and names. Now, one of the most intriguing aspects of Tartessian culture, one that has puzzled scholars for generations, is their script. Yes, the Tartessians had writing. Not much of it has survived, perhaps 100 inscriptions, most of them short, found on stone, stele, and pottery, but its existence tells us something important about the sophistication of their society. The script is a syllabary, meaning each symbol represents a syllable rather than a single sound. It seems to have been derived from the Phoenician alphabet, adapted to represent the sounds of the indigenous Iberian language. The inscriptions date mostly to the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, the later phase of Tartessian culture, and most are found in the southwestern region, particularly around the Algarve, in modern Portugal. Here's the frustrating part, the part that makes this such a perfect topic for a sleep meditation history. We can read the script, we know what sounds the symbols represent, but we cannot understand the language. It's a pre-Indo-European language, unrelated to Greek or Latin or any of the languages that would eventually dominate the Iberian Peninsula. So we can transcribe the inscriptions phonetically, but we cannot translate them. We do not know what they say. Imagine that. Messages carved in stone, preserved for 2,500 years, and yet their meaning is lost. Names, probably, because most short inscriptions tend to be names markers of ownership or memorials. Perhaps prayers or dedications. Perhaps something mundane. This olive oil belongs to so-and-so. Perhaps something profound. May the gods remember our people when we are dust. We simply do not know. This uncertainty, this gap in our knowledge, is characteristic of everything about Tartessos. We see glimpses, fragments, shadows. We cannot reconstruct the complete picture. And perhaps that's fitting for a bedtime story, for relaxing history designed to ease you into sleep. Not everything needs to be resolved. Some mysteries can remain mysteries, gentle puzzles for the mind to turn over as consciousness fades. Let us turn now to daily life in Tartessos, insofar as we can reconstruct it from the fragmentary evidence. This is where history becomes most intimate, most human, most conducive to the quiet reflection that helps us sleep. The Tartessians were farmers and herders, first and foremost. The elite may have controlled the silver mines and the long-distance trade, but the foundation of the society was agriculture. Wheat and barley grew in the river valleys. Grapevines thrived on the hillsides. The Mediterranean triad of grain, grapes, and olives was already established here. Cattle, sheep, and goats provided meat, milk, leather, and wool. The archaeological evidence shows that they raised pigs and hunted deer and wild boar in the forests. Their settlements varied in size, from small farming villages to larger centers that might have served as regional hubs. The houses were simple by later standards, structures with stone foundations and walls of mud, brick, or wattle and daub, roofs of thatch or clay tiles, floors of packed earth or clay, sometimes plastered. Inside, there would be a hearth for cooking and warmth, storage vessels for grain and oil, sleeping platforms or mats, simple wooden furniture. Picture a summer evening in such a settlement. The day's heat is fading. Smoke rises from cooking fires, carrying the smell of roasting meat and baking bread. Children play in the dusty streets while their parents finish the day's tasks, mending tools, feeding animals, preparing tomorrow's seed for planting. An old woman sits in a doorway, spinning wool on a drop spindle, the thread growing slowly, steadily, hypnotically. The repetitive motion, the quiet concentration, the sense of continuity with countless generations before and after this is the rhythm of ancient life. The bedtime history that underlies all civilization. The Tartessians were skilled metalworkers. This we know not just from the silver that made them famous, but from the bronze objects that have been found throughout their territory. Weapons, yes, swords and spearheads, axes and daggers, but also tools, ornaments, vessels. Bronze requires knowledge and organization. You need copper and tin, which do not occur together naturally. You need to extract the ores, smelt them, combine them in the right proportions. You need furnaces that can reach high temperatures, molds for casting, expertise in finishing and decoration. All of this implies specialization. Some people farmed, some people mined, some people smelted and cast and finished. This division of labor is one of the hallmarks of civilization, one of the features that distinguishes a complex society from a simple tribal one. The Tartessians had reached this level of organization by the late Bronze Age, making them contemporaries of, if not quite equals to, the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. Their pottery shows this progression as well. The earlier pottery is handmade, relatively simple in form and decoration. But by the later period, influenced by contact with Phoenician traders, wheel-made pottery appears. Forms become more varied and sophisticated. Amphorae for storing and transporting liquids. Craters for mixing wine and water. A Greek custom the Tartessians may have adopted. Fine tableware with painted decoration. Red ochre was popular for decoration, along with geometric pattern zigzags, triangles, concentric circles. Occasionally, more naturalistic designs appear. Birds, stylized plants, abstract figures that might be human or divine. Looking at pottery might seem like a minor detail, something too small to matter in the grand sweep of history. But pottery is intimate. It was made by human hands, used in daily life, broken and discarded and buried. Finding a pot shard 3,000 years later is like finding a message in a bottle, a tangible connection to someone's ordinary day. They poured water from this jug. They ate from this bowl. They lived in their own time as fully as we live in ours. This recognition, this empathy across the centuries is what makes history human, what makes it suitable for quiet contemplation as we prepare for sleep. Religion and ritual leave fainter traces than pots and tools, but they leave traces nonetheless. The Tartessians, like all ancient peoples, had their gods and their ways of honoring them. We do not know the names of their deities. Remember, we cannot read their inscriptions, but we can see evidence of religious practice. Sanctuaries have been found open-air sites, on hilltops or near springs, places where offerings were made. Bronze figurines of animals, bulls, horses, deer were common offerings, perhaps representing sacrifices, perhaps symbolic gifts to the divine. These same animals appear on the warrior's stele, suggesting they held special significance in Tartessian culture. The Phoenicians, when they established their trading posts on the coast, brought their own gods with them. Baal, Astarte, Melkartha, deities of Tyre and Sidon were worshipped in the new colonies. At Gadar, there was a famous temple to Melkart, the Phoenician Hercules, that became one of the most important religious sites in the Western Mediterranean. Did the Tartessians participate in these cults? Did they see parallels between the Phoenician gods and their own? Did religious ideas flow along the same trade routes as silver and pottery? We know that by the later Iron Age, after the Tartessian culture had faded, the peoples of southern Iberia worshipped a goddess, sometimes called Astarte, sometimes Tanit, clearly derived from Phoenician tradition. Perhaps this syncretism, this blending of religious ideas, began in the Tartessian period. Perhaps the great temple at Gador attracted pilgrims from the interior, Tartessians coming to the coast to make offerings at the shrine of the foreign god, who might grant safe passage for their silver ships. Breathe deeply. Let your mind rest on these images: a bronze bowl placed carefully on a stone altar, incense smoke rising in the Mediterranean sun, prayers spoken in a lost language. The human need to connect with something greater than ourselves. A need that transcends time and culture, that links us to these vanished people across the gulf of centuries, the Phoenicians. We cannot discuss Tartessos without discussing the Phoenicians at length, for the two are intertwined, their histories braided together like threads in a rope. Understanding this relationship is essential to understanding both cultures. And fortunately, It's a relationship rich in fascinating details, perfect for our relaxing history tonight. The Phoenicians were, quite simply, the greatest maritime traders of the ancient world. Based in the city-states of the Levantine coastire, Sidon, Byblus, Arvad, they were the middlemen of the Mediterranean and beyond, connecting east and west, north and south, carrying goods and ideas across the known world. They were skilled sailors, capable of navigating far from land using the stars. They invented or perfected many shipbuilding techniques, and most importantly, for our story, they were always looking for new sources of raw materials, new markets, new opportunities. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was in crisis. The great Bronze Age civilizations were collapsing. The sea peoples, whoever they were raiding and destroying cities. The Mycenaean palaces fell. The Hittite Empire disintegrated. Trade networks fractured. It was a dark age in the East, a time of violence and uncertainty. But for the Phoenicians, it was also an opportunity. With their competitors weakened or destroyed, they expanded their trading network westward. Cyprus first, then Sicily and Sardinia, then North Africa, where they founded Carthage, and finally to the Iberian Peninsula. They were drawn by the same thing that drew merchants everywhere: profit. And in Iberia, they found something more valuable than almost anything else in the ancient world: silver. The traditional date for the founding of Gdor is 1104 BCE, though modern archaeology suggests a slightly later date, perhaps around 800 BCE. Regardless of the exact timing, Gdor, modern Cadiz, became the westernmost outpost of the Phoenician world, a port city on an island near the mouth of the Guadalquivir, perfectly positioned to control trade with the interior. Imagine the scene: Phoenician merchants arriving in their sturdy sailing ships, vessels capable of carrying tons of cargo. They bring goods from across the Mediterranean: Egyptian faience beads, ivory from Africa, fine pottery and textiles, wine and oil, manufactured goods of bronze and iron. They bring knowledge too: the potter's wheel, new techniques in metalworking, the alphabet that would eventually evolve into the Tartessian script, artistic motifs that would be adopted and adapted by local craftsmen. And in exchange, they take silver, ingots, and bars of silver, refined in Tartessian workshops from or extracted in the mountains. Silver in quantities that made the Eastern Mediterranean gasp. The prophet Ezekiel, denouncing the pride of Tyre, mentioned Tarshish as a source of silver, iron, tin, and Lydda, remarkable catalogue of the mineral wealth of southwestern Iberia. But trade is never just about goods. Trade is about people meeting, talking, learning from one another. It's about cultural exchange, intermarriage, the gradual blending of traditions and ideas. Over the centuries of Phoenician-Tartessian contact, both cultures changed. The Tartessians adopted some Phoenician technologies and artistic styles. The Phoenicians, especially those living permanently in the Western colonies, absorbed aspects of the local culture. A hybrid culture developed along the coast, Phoenician in language and primary identity, but Iberianized in many practical ways. This is the ancient civilization's awesome of cultural contact, the gentle, gradual process of peoples learning from one another, more common and more important than the dramatic conquests that dominate traditional histories. It's the story of a Greek merchant learning enough Tartessian to haggle in the market, of a Phoenician woman marrying a Tartessian man and their children growing up bilingual, of a local craftsman studying an imported artifact and thinking, I could make something like that. These small interactions, multiplied by thousands, over centuries, are what create the texture of history. And their very ordinariness, their human scale, makes them perfect subjects for meditation as we drift toward sleep. The Phoenicians also brought literacy to the West, at least in a practical form. Their alphabet, derived ultimately from early Proto-Semitic scripts, was the most efficient writing system of the ancient world. Unlike cuneiform or hieroglyphics, it could be learned quickly and used for everyday purposes: trade records, letters, contracts. The Tartessians, observing this useful technology, adapted it to their own language, creating the Tartessian script we discussed earlier. Think about what this means. Before Phoenician contact, the Tartessians had no writing, or none that survived. Their culture was oral, preserved in memory, passed down through stories and songs. With writing, even the limited writing represented by 100 short inscriptions, came a new way of preserving information, a new relationship with time and memory. Names could be recorded permanently. Ownership could be definitively marked. Sacred texts, if they had them, could be written down rather than memorized. Of course, writing also served power. Those who could write had an advantage over those who could not. Knowledge could be controlled, restricted, made the privilege of a priesthood or an elite. We don't know how widespread literacy was in Tartessian society, but given that most ancient societies restricted it to a small percentage of the population, we can assume it was similar here. Most people could not read the inscriptions on the stones, could not write their own names, relied on specialists for these services. Still, the existence of writing at all marks Tartessos as a culture crossing a threshold, moving from prehistory into history proper, from a society known only through material remains to one that, however faintly, left verbal messages for the future. That those messages are unreadable to us is ironic, tragic even, but it does not diminish the significance of the attempt. Now let us consider the timeline of Tartessian culture, the slow arc of its rise and fall. For every civilization has its seasons, and understanding this rhythm is part of understanding the culture as a whole. This is narrative as lullaby, the long view of history that lets us see patterns rather than getting caught in details. The roots of Tartessian culture lie in the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE, or perhaps a bit earlier. This was the time of the Atlantic Bronze Age, a network of coastal communities from Ireland to Iberia that shared certain metalworking traditions and maintained maritime contact with one another. The warrior stelae we discussed earlier come from this period. These were the ancestors of the Tartessians, the people who first exploited the copper and tin and silver of the region, who established farming settlements in the river valleys, who began the long process of cultural development. Around 1000 to 900 BCE, we see increasing sophistication, larger settlements, more elaborate material culture, evidence of social hierarchy. This is still before regular Phoenician contact, or at least before the establishment of permanent Phoenician colonies, but there may have been occasional visits by Eastern traders, even at this early date. The Eastern Mediterranean was recovering from its dark age. Trade was resuming, and adventurous merchants were pushing westward again. The period from 800 to 550 BCE is often considered the height of Tartessian culture. This is when Phoenician colonies were firmly established, when trade was at its peak, when the silver was flowing east in greatest quantity. This is the period of the legendary king Arganthonios, assuming he was a real person rather than a composite of several rulers. This is when Tartessian material culture shows the strongest evidence of wealth An external influence, the gold treasures, the elaborate bronzes, the hybrid artistic style that blended local and Mediterranean traditions. Politically, we must guess. Was Tartessos a unified kingdom, as Greek sources sometimes suggest? Or was it a loose confederation of chiefdoms, united by culture and trade, but without strong central authority? The archaeological evidence is ambiguous. There are signs of social hierarchical burials with rich grave goods, fortified settlements that may have been chieftains' residences, but no single site has emerged as an obvious capital. No architectural remains clearly identify a royal palace. Perhaps Tartessos was like early Greece, a collection of independent city-states or chiefdoms that shared a cultural identity, but not a political one. Perhaps kingdom is too strong a word, a projection by Greek and Phoenician writers accustomed to the centralized monarchies of the East. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Perhaps there were powerful chieftains or kings who controlled regions of the Tartessian territory, who competed and sometimes cooperated with one another, whose power waxed and waned over generations. Perhaps, during certain periods, one ruler managed to dominate the others, creating something approaching a unified kingdom for a time. Without written records, beyond those undecipherable inscriptions, we can only speculate based on material patterns and comparison with other societies at similar stages of development. What we can say with confidence is that by 550 BCE, things were changing. The archaeological record shows disruption. Some settlements were abandoned. Others show evidence of destruction. The flow of luxury goods from the east declines. The distinctive Tartessian material culture begins to fade, replaced by what archaeologists call the Turdetani culture, probably descended from the Tartessians, but noticeably different, more influenced by Iberian cultures from the east, less distinctive, less wealthy. What happened? Why did Tartessian culture decline? Here we enter the realm of historical mystery, the kind that makes for perfect bedtime pondering because there's no single answer, just possibilities to consider as your mind drifts. One theory points to the Phoenicians themselves, specifically to changes in Phoenician colonization patterns. Around this time, Carthage, the great Phoenician colony in North Africa, was asserting itself, transforming from a simple trading post into an imperial power. Carthage began to dominate the western Mediterranean, controlling the other Phoenician colonies, monopolizing trade routes, perhaps extracting more tribute and giving less in return. If Tartessos had thrived on relatively free trade with multiple Phoenician cities, a Carthaginian monopoly would have been economically devastating. Some scholars have suggested that Carthage may have actively suppressed Tartessos, wanting to control the silver resources directly rather than relying on local intermediaries. There are vague references in later classical sources to Carthaginian conflicts in Iberia around this time, though the details are frustratingly sparse. If there was a Carthaginian conquest or economic strangulation of Tartessos, it was not dramatic enough to be recorded in detail by contemporary sources, or those records have been lost. Another theory focuses on environmental change. The Guadalquivir Delta is a dynamic landscape subject to flooding, silting, and the gradual movement of river channels. Earthquakes are not uncommon in the region. A major environmental disaster, massive flood, a significant earthquake, a shift in the river's course that rendered ports useless could have devastated the economic basis of Tartessian culture. Without good harbors, trade would have collapsed. Without trade, the wealth that sustained the elite would have dried up. The society could have fragmented, people dispersing to other regions or reverting to simpler, more localized economies. There's also the possibility of internal collapse, the kind of cyclical rise and fall that affects many societies. Perhaps the political system became unstable. Perhaps there was a succession crisis or a civil war. Perhaps overexploitation of the silver mines led to their depletion, removing the kingdom's primary source of wealth. Perhaps social inequality grew so extreme that the lower classes rebelled against the elite. Any of these could have triggered a cascade of failures that brought the civilization down. Or perhaps sand. This is the explanation I find myself drawn to as we lie here in the darkness. Considering the fragility of all human endeavors, perhaps it was simply time. Cultures, like living things, have lifespans. They emerge, they flourish, they fade. Not always because of dramatic catastrophe, but sometimes just because the conditions that supported them change, slowly and inexorably, until one day people realize the old ways no longer work, and they must adapt or disappear. The Tartessians adapted. They didn't vanish completely, no. People ever do, really. They became the Tordetni, a culture that Roman writers described as the most civilized of all the Iberian peoples, heirs to an ancient tradition of literacy and law. When Rome conquered Iberia in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, the Tordetani remembered that they had once had writing, once had a sophisticated culture. They told Roman officials that they had historical records going back 6,000 years, which was surely an exaggeration, but spoke to a sense of deep antiquity, of being the inheritors of something old and important. And eventually, of course, they became Roman, absorbed into the empire like everyone else, their distinct identity gradually fading, as Latin became the common language, as Roman law and custom replaced local traditions, as the old gods gave way to Jupiter and Mars, and eventually Christ. By the early centuries of the Common Era, Tartessos was a memory, a legend of a golden age in the distant past. But the land remained. The rivers still flowed to the sea. The hills still contained their veins of metal. The olive trees still bore their fruit. Life continued, as it always does, one generation following another, each leaving its own faint traces for archaeology to discover millennia later. This is the rhythm we seek in bedtime history, in sleep meditation history, in ancient civilizations asum, the long, slow rhythm of time that puts our own brief concerns into perspective, that reminds us we are part of something larger and longer than ourselves. Now, as we approach the end of our journey tonight, let us consider what Tartessos means, what its story teaches us, if it teaches us anything at all beyond the simple fact of its existence. Tartessos reminds us, first of all, that history is full of gaps. We know far more about ancient Rome and Greece than we do about Tartessos, because Rome and Greece left extensive written records, and their cultures continued to influence Europe directly through the centuries. But the absence of records does not mean the absence of importance. The Tartessians lived fully human lives. They loved and feared and hoped and dreamed. They built their society, such as it was, with as much thought and effort as the Romans built theirs. They simply had the misfortune to exist at the edge of the literate world, to have their own writing forgotten, and to leave their story for us to piece together from fragments. Every time a metal detectorist in Andalusia finds a bronze fibula in a field, every time excavators uncover another layer of ancient settlement, we learn a little bit more. The picture becomes slightly clearer. though it will never be complete. This is the nature of archaeological history: patience, humility, acceptance of uncertainty. Not all questions have answers. Not all stories have endings. And that's all right. That's part of the human condition, living with mystery, making peace with what we cannot know. Tartessos also reminds us of the importance of cultural exchange, of trade, not just in goods, but in ideas. The Phoenicians and Tartessians were very different peoples, different languages, different religions, different traditions, but they found ways to cooperate, to communicate, to benefit mutually from contact. Yes, there were probably tensions and conflicts we don't know about. Yes, the relationship was probably exploitative to some degree, as trade relationships involving unequal partners usually are. But there was also genuine exchange, genuine influence flowing in both directions, genuine human connection across cultural boundaries. In our own time, when cultural differences can seem like unbridgeable chasms, when we sometimes forget that people everywhere share fundamental similarities despite surface differences, the story of ancient trade networks offers a different perspective. For thousands of years, peoples have been meeting at the seashore, in marketplaces, at borders, finding ways to communicate and cooperate despite not speaking the same language or worshiping the same gods. This is also part of human nature: adaptability, curiosity, the drive to connect. And finally, Tartessos reminds us of impermanence. Everything changes, kingdoms rise and fall, languages are forgotten, even geography shifts over time. The Phoenician city of Gedor, that bustling port where east met west, is now buried under modern Cadiz. The exact location of Tartessian settlements remains debated because rivers have changed course, coastlines have altered, whole landscapes have been transformed. 3,000 years is a long time. Stone endures better than bronze, bronze better than wood, wood better than cloth, cloth better than flesh. Everything decays at its own rate, returning to earth, leaving only traces that grow fainter with each passing century. This is not a morbid thought, not really, not when we're settling into sleep. It's simply reality, the great cycle that all things follow. And there's something peaceful in accepting it, that we too will leave only traces, and that this is natural and right, and nothing to fear. The Tartessians built their settlements, knowing, as we all know in our deepest hearts, that nothing lasts forever. They raised their children anyway. They planted their crops, worked their metal, traded their goods, carved their stones, buried their dead with care and ceremony. They lived their lives with the time they had. What more can any of us do? As we lie here now, comfortable and safe, our own day drawing to its close, we can think of those distant people under the same stars we see, governed by the same sun, subject to the same seasons. The Bronze Age is gone. The Iron Age is gone. The classical world is gone. The medieval world is gone. Ages rise and pass like waves on the shore, each leaving its mark, each wearing away the marks of those before. But the sea remains, the stars remain. The human capacity for curiosity, for creating meaning, for telling stories remains. We tell the story of Tartessos tonight because it's worth telling, because it helps us sleep to know that others lived before us, that we're part of a chain stretching back beyond memory, beyond writing, beyond history, into the deep past where all human stories begin. The Atlantic wind that blew through the streets of Tartessian settlements 3,000 years ago still blows today, carrying the scent of salt and wild herbs. The Guadalquivir still flows to the sea, though its course has shifted, though the harbors are buried, though the ships that once sailed it are dust. The hills of Andalusia still turn golden in the summer sun. The olive trees still offer their shade. The earth still yields its treasures to those who dig. What has changed is that we remember, however imperfectly, however incompletely. We've recovered fragments of a story that was nearly lost, and in recovering it, we've kept it alive a little longer. This is what history does, what bedtime history and relaxing history and all forms of storytelling about the past do. They preserve memory, they honor the dead, they remind us that we are not the first people to wonder and hope and fear, and we will not be the last. The Tartessians are with us tonight as you drift toward sleep, their presence ghostly but real, their story part of the great tapestry of human experience that comforts us when we remember we're not alone, have never been alone, will never be alone, as long as we can reach back through time and touch, however faintly, those who came before. So rest now, knowing that the story continues, that tomorrow will bring another day, another chance to add your own thread to the tapestry. The ancient civilizations have spoken across millennia, whispered their secrets, shared their mysteries. Their world is gone, but their example remains, that it's possible to build something beautiful, something meaningful, even knowing it won't last forever. The silver of Tartessos has long since been melted down and recirculated, transformed into coins and jewelry and tableware scattered across the world, its original form forgotten. The people of Tartessos have long since returned to dust, their names forgotten except for the legendary Arganthonios, Silverman, and even his historicity is debated. The kingdom itself has dissolved back into the landscape from which it emerged, leaving only whispers and fragments, stories half remembered, mysteries unsolved. And yet they lived, they existed, they mattered in their time. Their silver bought kingdoms, their trade enriched nations, their culture contributed to the great mixing of traditions that made the Mediterranean world what it was. They are gone but not erased, forgotten but not entirely, lost but not beyond recovery. This is the gift of history for sleep, of relaxing history that calms the mind, the long view, the acceptance of change, the peace that comes from understanding our place in the flow of time. We are neither the first nor the last. We are a moment, brief and bright, like everyone who came before us, like everyone who will come after. Sleep well, knowing this. Sleep peacefully in your moment, in your time, in your place in the great chain of being. The Tartessians slept under the same moon you see tonight. They dreamed their dreams, as you will dream yours. They woke to face their days, as you will wake to face yours. And when their days were done, they returned to earth, as all things must, as all things do. The mystery of Tartessos is ultimately the mystery of all human civilizations, of all human lives. We cannot know the complete story. We can only gather the fragments that remain and try to imagine the whole. We honor what was by remembering what we can. We make peace with what's lost by accepting that loss is inevitable. We find meaning not in permanence but in the attempt itself, in the fact of having lived, having tried, having built something, however temporary, however doomed to fade. So let it fade now. Let the images drift apart like morning mist. Let the details dissolve back into comfortable darkness. The ships with their silver cargo sail into shadow. The bronze workers bank their fires for the night. The inscriptions on the stones blur and become unreadable again. The kingdom recedes into the past where it belongs. waiting patiently for the archaeologists to dig, for the scholars to puzzle over the evidence, for the sleepers to dream of distant shores and forgotten peoples. You've traveled far tonight, across miles and years, to a place that barely exists anymore, a time that's gone forever. But you've been there now, haven't you? You've walked those ancient streets in your imagination, felt the Mediterranean sun, heard the splash of silver being weighed in a merchant's balance. You've made the connection, however tenuous, between your moment and theirs, between your life and the lives of people whose names we'll never know, but whose humanity we can still feel across the gulf of ages. This is enough. This is more than enough. This is what we came for tonight. Rest now. Let it all go. The history will keep. The mysteries will remain. Tomorrow you can wake and live your own moment in the long chain of moments that is human time. But tonight, for now, simply breathe, simply drift, simply sleep. The story of Tartessos is ending for tonight, but it never truly ends. Somewhere in Andalusia, beneath the modern streets and fields, beneath layers of soil and time, the traces remain, waiting, persistent, patient as stone. And you, listening to this, you've become part of the story now too. You've carried these people a little further forward in time, remembered them for a few hours, wondered about their lives. That's all any of us can hope for, really, to be remembered for a little while, to have our stories told, to leave some trace that others might find and think about and connect with, however briefly. So thank you for listening. Thank you for wondering. Thank you for letting the ancient world into your thoughts tonight, for making space in your mind for people who lived 3,000 years ago on the edge of the known world, who worked metal and traded goods and loved their children and watched the same stars wheel overhead through the same endless night. They're sleeping now, have been sleeping for millennia, and soon you'll join them in that vast democracy of sleep where all humans meet, where time collapses, where the differences between Bronze Age and Modern Age cease to matter, because we're all just humans, all just dreamers, all just brief flickers of consciousness in the long dark. The Tartessian mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps it always will. But mysteries don't need solutions to be meaningful. Sometimes the not knowing is itself the gift, the space where imagination can play, where we can project our own questions and hopes and fears onto the blank spaces of history. Let those blank spaces be restful now. Let the not knowing be peaceful. Let the lost language remain lost, the hidden cities remain hidden, the secrets stay secret. There's time enough in the waking world for questions. Here now in the borderland between consciousness and sleep, let there be only the quiet recognition that we're part of something larger, something that includes the Tartessians and the Phoenicians and the Romans and everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. The river flows, the stars turn. The earth spins through space, as it has for billions of years, and will for billions more. We are passengers on this spinning rock, temporary residents of this particular moment in time, blessed with consciousness for a little while, able to look back and wonder about those who came before, able to imagine those who will come after. And in this moment, this particular moment, as you drift toward sleep, you're connected to all of it, the deep past, the unknown future, the vast present spreading out across the globe, connected by the simple fact of being human, of being alive, of breathing and thinking and feeling and soon, very soon, sleeping and dreaming. The story is complete now, or as complete as it can be with the evidence we have. Tartessos has had its say, has shared its fragments, has offered its mysteries for your consideration. The relaxing history has done its work, calming your mind, giving your thoughts something to turn over gently as you release the tensions of the day. So now, finally, we come to the end of our journey. Back from Bronze Age Iberia to your own bed, your own room, your own time. Back from the edge of the known world to the comfort of the familiar. Back from the mysteries of the past to the simple, immediate mystery of sleep itself, that daily disappearance into unconsciousness that we trust will be followed by waking, by another day, by continuing life. Close your eyes now, if they're not already closed. Feel your breathing, slow and steady. Feel the weight of your body against the mattress. Feel the peace of knowing that you have nowhere to be, nothing to do but rest. The Tartessians would understand. They knew about rest, about the end of the day, about the relief of laying down burdens and closing eyes and letting consciousness fade into dreams. Across the centuries, across the miles, across the vast distance that separates your world from theirs, there's still this commonality. We all need sleep. We all know the blessing of rest after labor, of peace after turmoil, of surrender after striving. We all return each night to that mysterious state where the conscious mind releases its grip, and something else takes over, something older, something that doesn't need understanding or explanation. Sleep well, then sleep peacefully. Let the story of Tartessos settle into your memory, joining all the other stories there, becoming part of your own internal landscape. Perhaps you'll remember it tomorrow, perhaps not. Perhaps it will surface in dreams, fragmentary and strange images of bronze and silver, of ancient ships, of languages lost and found. Or perhaps it will simply fade like morning mist, leaving only a sense of having traveled somewhere distant and returned safely. Either way is fine, either way is enough. The purpose was not to memorize, but to relax, not to study, but to drift, not to solve mysteries, but to rest in the acceptance of mystery. The Tartessian kingdom is gone, the people are gone, the language is gone, but the story remains, carried forward by people like you who listened tonight, who wondered, who cared enough to spend a few hours thinking about a culture that vanished millennia ago. That's the real immortality, not monuments of stone but memories passed on, stories retold, the chain of human consciousness extending back through time, linking us all. You're part of that chain now. You've received the story of Tartessos, turned it over in your mind, added it to your store of knowledge about the world and its history, and someday maybe you'll mention it to someone else. I once heard about this mysterious Bronze Age kingdom in Spain, and the story will travel a little further, survive a little longer, connect one more person to that distant time and place. But that's for someday, for tomorrow, for the waking world. Tonight, there's only this: your breathing, your heartbeat, your gradually relaxing body, your slowly quieting mind, the gentle descent into sleep, natural as rivers flowing to the sea, inevitable as seasons changing, peaceful as sunset over ancient hills where long ago, impossibly long ago, people lived and worked and rested, just as you rest now. The mystery remains, the story continues, but for you, for tonight, it's time to let it all go. Time to release your grip on consciousness and trust in the natural rhythm of sleep and waking that has sustained humanity since the beginning of time. Time, finally, to say good night. Good night.